My name is Bharat. I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Center in Delhi. And in opening today's event, what I wanted to do is to just very quickly give you a sense of what the center is and what we do, and then to just very briefly introduce Mr. Nainan and Bill. The center has been in existence for very close to 2 years now. At the end of March, we'll come up on our second anniversary. And the reason that we set this up is to provide a hub, provide a home away from home for our faculty members at the University of Chicago that are interested in doing programs, research, teaching, or any other activity related to India. In fact, all of South Asia is what the center spans. So what we do is to provide grants to our faculty members that are interested in doing work on India, and that has already translated into a number of really vibrant research programs that are running on the field across different parts of the country. And many of those programs culminate in seminars, workshops, and other academic discussions here at the center. In addition to that, what we also want to do is to make the center an intellectual destination in its own right, a place for interesting, vibrant, rich discussions on topics that matter to all of us. So it's in keeping with that mission that we do a number of programs that are public in nature. Many of these are free and open to the public. And today's, of course, is a great example of one of those. 2015 was actually, of course, our first full year in existence. And across all of 2015, we did 100 programs like this, with over 5,500 people having attended those programs. So I think it's already turned into a really vibrant space for wonderful discussions like today's. And to those of you who have been here before, thank you for your support in making this center such a success. And for those of you here who are here for the first time, hopefully this has given you a sense of the kind of programming that we do here. I'd also encourage you to visit our website. It's uchicago.in. It's a great way to get a sense of all of the different programs that we have going on here. You can also interact with us on social media. You can see our Facebook name and our Twitter handle on one of the banners over there. And for those of you that are on Twitter, we'd encourage you to tweet about today's event as well. Nainan at UC Delhi is the hashtag that we've created for today. So hopefully you'll make use of that. Turning to today's event, I'd like to quickly introduce our speakers. It's a real pleasure to introduce our very distinguished guest, Mr. T.N. Nainan. Mr. Nainan serves as the chairman of Business Standard Limited. During almost a quarter century at the helm of different publications, Mr. Nainan has been the editor of Business Standard, also its publisher from 1996, the Economic Times, and Business World, bringing about radical change and achieving radical growth in all of them during his stewardship. He was also the executive editor at India Today in the 1980s, and for many years, he has been a television commentator on economic and business issues. Thank you again, Mr. Nainan, for being here. Bill Kuser is the Associate Dean for Global Outreach at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. Based in Hong Kong, Bill has helped hugely already in raising the school's stature and activity in India. Thank you very much for being here, Bill, and I'll turn this over to you.
For a journalist who's used to writing 800 or 1,000 words and going home at the end of the day, the prospect of doing a major thing is forbidding. But Vijay Joshi at Oxford is an old friend and has also been writing for the Business Standard. So he comes to India a couple of times a year, and we met for lunch, and he said, I'm thinking of writing this book, so why don't you join me and we'll do it together. And the idea that he had was exactly what you just said, that there is no comprehensive book on India, which covers, he's an economist, and I'm a business journalist, but covers not just business and economics, but all the other issues as well. And there is a gap which gives us scope to write a nice book. So actually we started out together, but then our writing styles didn't match and it was difficult to meld it together. So we finally agreed with the publishers that we would write two separate books, which they would publish. So actually Vijay is just about finishing his stuff, manuscript.
Okay.
So it should come out in a few months. It's a little more academic than this one, but that's the way he deals with issues. So actually that's how the book came into being. But the idea was that there is no comprehensive book on India. And we went back looking at all the books that have been published, and none of them actually quite fit that bill. So that was the idea, that anyone who wants to read and understand, here's one book that sort of tries to give it to you.
Simply a matter of here's laying out what some of the issues and prospects are.
Well, obviously the hope would be that it would stimulate some change. but it would be asking for a lot of a book to do that. Particularly when I think most of our decision-making class doesn't actually read these books. I mean, I've sent out copies to a lot of people in government, and I've actually got zero comeback from them. Whereas lots of other friends who are in business and media, of course, and from the diplomatic world, some of the ambassadors in Delhi have been very, very encouraging in the way they've responded to the book. So there are people who are doing that, but from the government, just no.
No reaction.
Either they're too busy, or they read it only when they retire, or I don't know what.
What, you know, as I've read through the book, you are very frank in lots of areas. You have a clear outline of many of the frustrations and challenges facing India, but also lay out some of the wonderful opportunities. And people asked me earlier today, is it generally an optimistic or pessimistic book? And I said, you know, I'm not really sure. How would you characterize your view?
That is actually a good question, because I found that a lot of people who read it feel I'm being pessimistic. And actually, my take on what I've thought I've written is a cautiously optimistic book. That it's laying out a scenario where India will do better progressively over time in a variety of ways and for different reasons. And we would never be a story completely done, so to speak. It's always work in progress. It's partially done. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's messy. It's all of what India is. So it's never a sort of cut and dry, you know, kind of picture. So it's complicated, but it is not pessimistic. It is actually cautiously optimistic. It's saying that don't expect us to get everything right. Not going to happen. But there is enough in the system to make it keep moving in the right direction.
One of the things that has, I think, has an effect on how people view whether they're optimistic or pessimistic is the measures one uses and who you're comparing India to. And one of the things you point out early on in the book is this question of size and the relevant measures and the relevant comparatives.
Yes.
And I think it'd be useful to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you raised that. The 2 or 3 points I make in that is, number one, that size is what defines India. Even when we were, pathetic income levels, huge poverty, tiny share of world trade, half of 1%, the country mattered. And it mattered because of size. And size in many different ways, population, geography, et cetera, et cetera. What will define India in the future as well is size. Now also because the economy is reaching a certain threshold where, and I make the point that even as recently as 2008, at the time of the financial crisis, we were the 12th largest economy in the world. And in 7 short years, by 2015, we moved from 12th to 7th largest, almost unnoticed. And again, most people don't realize that we've averaged in the last 7 years more than 7% GDP growth annually, which is faster than, it's slower than the previous decade or the previous 5 years, but faster than any other long-term period we have. So we sometimes don't give ourselves enough credit for what we do. And the competitors, I've argued, we've often used the wrong comparators. We keep comparing with, let's say, Southeast Asia. But the point is that our starting position was way worse than almost any Southeast Asian economy. And I go into the numbers. We've reached Taiwan, some other number, 40 years later, and so on. So these were countries that started off at a much higher level than India was. And the fact is that it was India that was a byword for poverty, not Malaysia or Philippines or Indonesia or any of those countries. So we started off, and then I'd look at Angus Madison's sort of historical reworking of numbers. to ask, is there any country that started off with the socioeconomic numbers that we did back in 1950 and which has done better than us? So let's now look at, so now this is not a very attractive set of countries to compare against because you're comparing with, you know, most of Africa and some countries in Indochina and so on. And then you get the explanation that there is no country other than Botswana because of diamonds, which has started off at our level and ended up ahead of us. So now that's a different picture altogether. And then I say that if you take the last quarter century, even you take all of the rapid growth of Asian countries, we've grown faster than all of them in the last quarter century. That includes Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Korea, Taiwan, a lot. Their growth period was earlier, and then after the Asian crisis in 97, they all slowed down. So from about 1988 to 2013, which is the period I looked at, we've actually outdone all of them. So sometimes we don't give ourselves credit for what we've done. And if you look ahead, and in these 25 years, we've done about 6.5% annual GDP growth. And as I mentioned, we've done 7 plus actually, the last 7. So it's reasonable to expect, unless the world implodes. I mean, at the moment, you come from Hong Kong, everybody's so nervous there about what's going to happen in China. But at the moment, the world looks a little uncertain. But unless things just fall apart, there's really no reason why you shouldn't expect to continue to do 7%. And then every decade, you're seeing quantum leaps. And I give the example of what happens to markets because, number one, today's middle class broadly, and the number I put out is 27% in 2011, maybe a little higher now. So let's say 30% of India's properly middle class using an international income benchmark. So the system works for 30% of this population. Assume it 10 years from now, because the economy is doubled, and has become the 4th largest economy in the world. It overtakes Germany, Britain, France, a lot. And you then, on the one hand, get markets which are the 3rd largest in the world. And all the forecasts, not by Indian forecasters, but international forecasters, it'll be the 3rd largest car market, bigger than Germany, bigger than Japan. It'll have the 3rd largest civil aviation industry. And 3rd because China and the US will always be here on every number. So you can't hope to be 1st or 2nd, right. Except maybe in mobile phones. But, but otherwise, you're 3rd largest in civil aviation. Outbound tourism, Indians traveling overseas, in the last decade, it's gone up from 5.5 million to 16 million. So it's trebled. And the next decade, it'll treble again. So now 16 to 50 million is an order of magnitude difference. And you think of what's going to happen to aviation, which is why IATA says this will be the 3rd largest aviation market. So when you get scale, suddenly you count in ways that you didn't before. So, which is why I say it's a turn of the tortoise, because we've been slow. We've been left behind by all the rapid hares that ran ahead of us. But the time has now come when you can see that the combination of size and speed, and I make the point about how speed is different from momentum.
Right.
Because momentum comes with mass. So momentum is speed plus mass. A bullet traveling at 600 miles an hour is different from, I don't know, a meteor traveling at 600 miles an hour because sheer mass of it is so much more energy. So when, let's say today we're a 2.2 trillion economy, but suppose a 4 trillion economy is growing at 6 or 7%, the sheer impact of that is what we've seen happen with China. Right. It shakes up all world markets. Right. So 10 years from now, you might well be doing that. Right. So that's the scenario that I lay out.
So it's interesting that, I mean, one of the things that struck me is that perhaps the best comparative countries would be sub-Saharan African countries looking at 1950 to now. But because of the size issue, the typical comparison is always China.
Yes.
And as I think you point out, that may not be a fair comparison. Yeah. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the India-China, which you touch on in a couple of full chapters.
I've actually got a whole chapter up in the beginning in front to say that this whole India-China comparison is simply a wrong thing to do. And it started with Jack Welch back in 1989, landing up here before our reform program began, 2 years before the reform program began. And I remember being at a lunch which was organized by GE for him, where we were sitting down at a table and he said, 2 markets for the future, China and India. And GE is going to focus on these 2. And you know, in 1989, you're not used to listening to that. So you say, hello, what is this guy saying? And then you began to see more and more people, and Jairam Ramesh coined this term, Chindia, China, India.
Right.
And you basically were saying that they're both geographically large, they're both civilization entities in a way, they're both huge populations, they're both countries that went into decline and now sort of finding themselves again. So there are some similarities which, when you actually look at country performance, is misleading because the operative factors are totally different. China has had 2,000 years of centralized administration with a meritorious bureaucracy, and we have not. They've had central authority waxing and waning at different points of time, whereas ours has been feuding monarchies. They've had, they have a sort of great Han majority, whereas we are as diverse as you can get in caste, community, language, ethnicity, and so on. So their history, they can use nationalism, and they can use a history to build nationalism. And here, you try to build nationalism, it becomes a very contentious issue. So how do you motivate the people? And then the whole business about, you know, what Lee Kuan Yew said very dismissively at a thing that I'll never forget, because just a brief digression, but there was a business conference in Singapore, and Lee Kuan Yew was speaking at lunch, and the focus was on China, inevitably. And I was at a table where there was a guy from McKinsey who had come from the Beijing office. So after this whole China business had been going on, this chap stood up and said, Minister, mentor, or whatever he was being called at that time, you know, you've been talking about China, but there are 2 countries that are rising, China and India. So what about India? And the minute he asked this, I was telling myself, you know, this is asking for trouble. And Lee was so dismissive. He said, you know, the Chinese do, Indians talk. And it sort of, the hall erupted in laughter. And I wanted, you know, to be swallowed by So, and I've quoted that in the book, to say that we are an argumentative people. And we find it difficult to follow standard operating procedure. Chinese can do a thing rote all the time, whereas we always want to be inventive.
Do it your own way.
Doing something else. You know, do it differently.
Right.
And it shows up even in industry. I was talking some years ago to a production director for Siemens worldwide in Berlin. And I asked him, I said, you know, you've got stuff in India for decades and you've got stuff in China. So how do you compare the workers in the 2 countries? So he said, if you want the same thing done over and over and over again, there is no worker better than the Chinese. But if you want a little application of mind, a little difference in the way it's done and done differently, then the Indian workers far superior. And in the book, I quote this example of this leather manufacturer, High Design, who is quoted in The Economist as saying that he tried his level best to get his leather workers to produce with the efficiency that the Chinese managed to do, which was, I think, if I remember the figures right, 12 bags a day per worker or something. And he was at 3. So he said, no matter what I tried, I couldn't get past 9. So finally I said, I can't compete like this. So I can only compete if I introduce some different element, some design thing or some other unique element to the product, so that I'm not competing just on
Right.
price and Chinese.
Here, price and efficiency.
And this is true in textiles and garments as well. When you talk to, I've quoted some of them in the garment exporters. again they say that you are able to compete when there's a little bit of a design thing that you can do. So you're not just turning on the same shirt 5,000 times a day. So there are fundamental differences, which is why I don't believe we can do this copying of China on manufacturing. It's just not going to work. Partly because the times have changed. There's much more automation and so on. So the two countries are very different.
Right, right.
And I think it's misleading to compare them.
Well, and certainly I think through much of, certainly in the United States and around much of the rest of the world, it is a natural comparison just simply because of size.
Yeah.
And,
But even
and,
size, though, is not-
and ignorance in the United States, certainly. People just don't have any conception of what's going on in this part of the world. So they don't have a basis from which to make valid comparisons, which I think you point out very, very, very nicely.
Even on size, I mean, China is 5 times our size in
Yeah.
economy.
Right.
So, and I make the point that in India, we keep comparing ourselves with China. Nobody in China compares themselves with India. They're comparing with the US,
Yeah.
you know?
Right.
So, and in India, we don't compare with Iran,
Right.
which is 1/5 our size. So why should China compare with India, which is 1/5 their size? You know, this is a game that we are sitting here and playing, but those guys are not doing this.
I think every organization, countries as well as organizations, I mean, we as a business school look to certain schools as competitors, and they may or may not look at us as competitors, and vice versa. So I think that's human nature, perhaps. So you're cautiously optimistic, but I want to begin to touch a little bit on some of the challenges. One of the quotes, and I don't have the full quote here, but there was someone you mentioned who said, when we bet on the people, we do well. When we bet on markets, we do okay. And when we bet on policies and government, it's a disaster, more paraphrasing. Explain a little bit more what that means to you and what some of the issues are between people, markets, and policy.
If you look at the success stories, they are fundamentally the quality of the Indian person. Of course, helped by education in the better educational establishments, not all of them. But it's the quality of the Indian human being which makes a difference. Now, it could be in tech. I mean, I know a German who used to head SAP's Bangalore office for years. They had 3 research centers in the world, 3 major research centers. One was in California, one was in Germany, and the third was in India. Later, they've added one more in Beijing. But at that time, they had these 3. So I said, these are the questions they're going on asking everybody. So I asked him, I said, tell me, compare, tell me what you get. So he said, in India, we get California-style productivity with Indian costs. You talk to Shell, which has a major research facility in Bangalore, and really, cutting-edge stuff. And you ask them, did you base it here because of cost? They said, initially we did, but now actually these guys are better than what we have elsewhere. So it's a quality of the Indian worker, mostly white collar, admittedly, which has made the difference to tech, to pharmaceuticals, to the guys, the diaspora or the Indians in the. So you can bet on the Indian person or the Indian people, and companies have made it a success. If IBM has more workers here than anywhere else in the world, and so on. So that's one. So you bet on the Indian people, it works. And bet on the Indian markets for a long time. Nothing much is happening in the Indian market. We were growing at 3.5% or 5%, and it was slow. And everybody else was Southeast Asia was a big story, and before that it was the Tigers, Korea, and so on, and Taiwan, and so on. So we were not important as a market, and if a lot of people, most of the Western companies who actually came here in the early 90s, in the first flush of enthusiasm about liberalization, a lot of them just failed. Because they said, hello, 1 billion people, 200 million middle class. This is an opportunity waiting to happen. And Kellogg would come and opened up, and they thought they were going to get huge sales, and it just collapsed. So then you sack your chief executive, and all this goes on.
Right.
So the market wasn't working for them, but now it is. You talk to Ford, and they are setting up, they want to set up their single largest car manufacturing facility in the world in Gujarat. Why? And they're just desperately hoping that we come to terms with our free trade agreement with the European Union, because they want to send cars to Europe. Yeah? And they say, there is nowhere else we can make these cars at lower cost and the same quality. So the market is now also beginning to work because mobile phone, you know the whole list. So the market's also now beginning to work, and if you are the seventh largest economy, heading to be the fourth or fifth largest, then obviously the market size is important. Finally, this policy, which just keep bumbling along. Um, I mean, I don't know when we'll sort of do evidence-based policy making in a way that makes complete sense. All change seems so difficult. Um, you know, sometimes we don't realize how difficult it is when you're sitting inside government to make those changes. Somehow the perspective from outside is clearer, but you're sitting inside, you see all the complications and all the ways in which things can go wrong. They're not, they are smart people. You know about Lant Pritchett's thing from Harvard, where he says, he calls it the flailing state, which I referred to in the book, that you have really smart guys who are at the head, who are really comparable to the best in the world, but the arms and legs are flailing because nobody listens to anybody. I mean, there was a report in the Times of India about a week or 10 days ago about this crazy flyover outside Vasant Vihar, which you won't know about, but everybody who lives in Delhi will know how they built it too narrow, and so it's causing endless bottlenecks as you come out from the airport. So they need to build another one next to it, and they decided on that 3 years ago, but nothing's happened. Why? Because the National Green Tribunal wants to know whether this area is going to be an extension of the ridge, which is a green belt. And if it is, you're not going to be allowed to cut any trees. So the Green Tribunal, which is mandated under law, has to first decide whether you're going to be allowed to cut any trees. It's 3 years. And there are high-pressure gas lines and some other stuff. So they were told, okay, buddies, move all this because we're doing this. And they said, well, give us 70 crores and we'll do it, because that's what it costs. 70 crores is 700 million rupees. So, so they would say, well, why would it cost so much? You're supposed to move it. It's public purpose. Nobody's going to pay you any money. Just move it. So, number two. And number three, when you want to build this, you need to divert traffic to roads on either side so that you don't get a problem during the construction phase. Now, you can't do that because there are encroachments on those roads. And now, who's going to remove those encroachments? Nobody wants to take that land. It becomes an issue. So, this one flyover is going to take 10 years to build. And if you ask yourself, why can't we do it the way China does it? I mean, they built the Beijing-Shanghai superfast train line in 2.5 years.
Right.
We can't acquire the land in 2.5 years. And it's not because we don't know how to acquire land, but look at this. The system is federal, it's all manner of independent forces working. So it's not China.
So are there, say, 2 or 3 policy areas that you would like to tackle first that you think are some of the most, causing some of the most difficulty?
I only have 2, which is health and education.
Okay.
I mentioned the whole issue about factors of production being freed, which is land, labor, capital, and we have big issues on all of them. I mean, if 70% of Indian banking is government-owned banks, and with all the new disclosures that are coming out, on average, they've got about 8% of their loan book is non-performing. And the capital adequacy is about 10-12%. And some of those banks have non-performing loans of 13-14%. So fundamentally, they're bankrupt. So the government has to recapitalize. The government has fiscal problems. So your capital market is, and this is a banking-centric capital market. I mean, the stock market is there, but it's small. The bond market doesn't exist.
Right.
So you have a fundamental problem with your capital market. You have a problem with your land market, with both before and after the new law. You have a problem with the labor market because even Mr. Modi, with a massive mandate, when he was asked, why don't you address this, he was saying, no, I don't want to upset trade unions. So if you don't free the factors of production, how do you get the system to higher productivity level? So those are constraints. But I really see no reason why we should not be addressing health and education. And I've mentioned in the book, I feel really concerned about the capture of the healthcare system by these corporate hospitals. A complete outrage. And then they get tax benefits through this medical insurance thing where the patients only go to them. And if you took that same money and diverted it and built public hospitals, there are 3 patients for every bed in a Delhi public hospital. If you treble the number of beds, you'd get a proper public health system going, tertiary. So, I think health and education.
Tell me more about the education piece, given that.
Sorry?
Tell me a bit more about your views on the education piece, given that that's kind of our business.
We
least at one
have
level.
average years of schooling of 5.5. China has 7.7. Most developed economies have 10, 11 plus. And we were stuck for a long time at 4.5. Now we managed to move to 5.5, partly because through the last decade and this whole Millennium Development Goals drive, we've achieved universal enrollment at primary level. But as the annual status of survey on education finds out, class 5 students can't do class 2 level maths or comprehension. And the only time when we sent our students, made our students participate in this international PISA comparison, our students came out second worst, ahead of one country, which is Kyrgyzstan. Now, if that is the state of your school education, somebody's going to do something about it. You don't hear anybody talking about it. It's all about who's appointed to the FTII and what's going on about a student suicide in the University of Hyderabad. Nobody talks about schools. And just beyond me.
Well, it's interesting, given how how culturally important education seems to be here in India, and the very high quality at the very top of the higher education pyramid, that the rest of the system doesn't seem to work as well as it should or could.
As a society, we value education. Parents will spend their last rupee to send their kid to whatever they can afford or whatever they can't afford. So it's not that the system does not value education, it does. But you're not providing what people want. And it's a non-functioning system.
And what are some of your thoughts on how to address that? I mean, one of the things I think you talk about, and I've read elsewhere, is absenteeism by teachers and people coming to school and not having anybody there or leaving early, what have you. And there does seem to be a lack of accountability
Indeed.
all the way down the system. What's possible to be done?
I have no solution because I refer to Banerjee and Duclos and this marvelous book they've written called Poor Economics, which is very easy to understand. Any layman can read it and understand it. It's a terrific book. It's based on random surveys and evidence-based conclusions. And the extraordinary conclusion they come to is that don't expand the government system because it won't work. I mean, for 2 people to say that from MIT, it's quite extraordinary. And we interviewed Abhijit Banerjee for the book, and he was saying this won't work. But I can't see, no country has developed with essentially private education or private medical care. Every country's got public health care and public education. And if you can't fix it, you have to find some way to fix it.
Yeah, some of it, I mean, certainly in the United States, public education, but public education generally at a very low level. I mean, so where I come from, the school district encompasses 60,000 people.
Depends on the school district.
Yeah.
That's true.
So, I mean, yes, your big cities are much larger, but it's not nationwide.
That is true.
The accountability is a much lower level.
Yeah, but I'll give you the example of, we had a chief minister for 15 years before she got replaced 2 years ago when she lost the election, Sheila Dikshit. And one of these chaps who runs a couple of private schools, so the lady actually went to her and said, Sheila, if you give me 2 of your government schools, I'll show you what I can do with them. I don't want any money. I'll use the same teachers. And I will pay too much for them because Sheila said, I don't want to. I've been to municipal schools in Mumbai, where there are a couple of these NGOs. The municipal schools mandatorily have to offer the local language Marathi as a medium of instruction. So you have English stream and you have a Marathi stream. Now, no kid from any slum wants to go to the Marathi medium. They all want English.
Yeah.
So you have entire floors in the schools in fairly low-income areas which are empty. Classrooms, doors, but no students. So I know a couple of these people who went to the municipal corporation and said, this is lying empty. We will bring our teachers. and we will get the kids from the slums, and we will teach them our way, and you just let us function. And the corporation said, all right. And the results are amazing. So it just tells you what can be done.
So staying on this theme of kind of government role, one of the things you mentioned, and I don't know if I get the quote properly, but is that the government really should shed all non-essential activities. And what do you view as non-essential activities? What do you think is the proper role of government in India in an ideal situation? And again, avoiding
Well,
what's political possible.
I mean, you spend 20,000 crores on Air India, and now want to spend another 20,000 crores on Air India. Why? You have profitable private airlines. The Air India's share of the market has shrunk steadily. Why do you want to run an airline? Why do you want to run hotels? Why do you want to get into all these activities when you're not hiring teachers? You don't have enough judges. You don't have enough policemen. We have a large number of policemen that you need to have. So we are an undergoverned country. So your government should be focusing on law and order, justice system, the jails, school teachers. Why are we going into all these other areas? I don't understand why they just don't privatize mining. Okay, it got nationalized in the 1970s. Why are we staying with it? Just let the big companies come in and mine. You have a proper regulator, which you don't have today, and let them mine. Why should Coal India have a monopoly?
So many things, particularly airlines, seem to be kind of a national status symbol somehow. And I've never fully understood that. I mean, do you have any perspectives on why does the national government decide they want an airline, whether it's in India or elsewhere? What is it about politicians that feel that that's appropriate?
Well, I think the way the aviation industry was organized, you had national flag carriers, but it's long past that.
Yeah.
You have foreign investment in domestic carriers. So, Capital the Gulf, Singapore. If somebody took those decisions, you might be surprised to find that people cheer it. And say, yeah. I mean, okay, the employees might be upset, or you give them a handshake, or make sure they're taken care of. Cheaper than spending this kind of money on it.
Yeah, and given that your comment about the airline industry here having a potential to grow extraordinarily quickly, you could take the Air India assets and turn them into a private airline that could conceivably do much better than it currently does.
So all governments, not just the center, states, they're all busy doing things and there's no business doing.
Let's touch just briefly on the corruption issue. Again, you have a whole chapter on corruption. Perspectives on what can be done, what should be done, the challenges therein.
My sense is that, I'm sort of going out on a limb on this one, is that the really big ticket corruption we may not see again quite the same way because of what happened between 2010 and 12. And I mentioned that 13 or 14 people were in jail, senior politicians, or being charged, potentially in jail. So the thing that you still have not found an answer to how to finance the political system and the electoral system. And we have still, we're trying to use technology to try and get rid of petty corruption, which is an irritant for most people. It's still work in progress. So once again, it'll get better, but it won't be perfect.
You talk in particular about the Allocatus. And,
I think that was the
there.
extreme. The reason why I say it won't happen again is that the Manmohan Singh government was a coalition government. The Prime Minister effectively did not appoint his cabinet colleagues because it was a part of a coalition arrangement. So the coalition partners would say, I want this portfolio or that portfolio. And then they would actually nominate somebody from their MP list who would be made the minister. And in fact, the telecom minister's appointment was announced in Chennai by Karunanidhi. It wasn't announced by the Prime Minister. So it tells you how much the coalition partners were deciding And now you're not appointing him. You can't dismiss him because your government will fall. So the guy is an independent republic. And he has to give money to his party bosses. He wants to make money for himself. And the prime minister either couldn't or wouldn't stop it. That is certainly not the case today. You have a strong prime minister. You have a single party government. He appoints and he will sack. So the ministers will not try to play ducks and drakes the way they did in the previous government. Therefore, I think this is a fundamentally different situation from what used to exist.
Great, good.
And the telecom thing happened really because of the coalition.
Right, right. But clearly big and visible and large dollars at stake.
Yeah.
Last subject, and then we'll open it up for questions, is kind of looking forward at India's role in kind of global geopolitics. Comparison with China, balancing off China's growing power. Just some of your views there of where coalitions could be, should be, are being developed, and what India's role could be in kind of thinking about the whole region, what its position ought to be.
Well, India's diplomatic position has always been that we want strategic autonomy. The words used in a different era was non-alignment. The words used today are strategic autonomy. They mean the same thing, frankly. We don't want to get caught in this somebody else's war. And we want to be standalone and we want our own turf. Now, that's been threatened by the rise of China. And it's interesting that all the alignment of interests with the US are to the east of India because of the China factor. The US wants you to play a larger role there. The US wants you to expand your navy there. You get Japan and the US and India doing joint naval exercises. Australia is joining. This entire thing of alignment of interests is because of China. And then if you look to the west of India, there is a complete divergence of interests. A total divergence of interests on Afghanistan. I mean, the US kept India out of the key negotiations for the post arrangement after the coalition would move out. There is disagreement on everything to do with the Arab countries. There is disagreement on all the multilateral issues, whether it's trade or, you name it.
Trade, climate.
So there is climate change, all of them. So the only alignment is because of China. Now, I mentioned this, that there are two worlds operating here, and the operative word really is China. And if you don't strengthen yourself, you could actually lose out. And that's a risk we run. That you never know, it may seem highly unlikely today, but you never know when a big two can get together. And then you have left nowhere. Obama tried it in his first trip to China and got a rebuff and came back so angry that he then changed his whole position. But on that first visit, the declaration actually said that the US and China work together on South Asia. It's got everybody here really riled. So you have to be careful. So you need to build up your strength, and the bottom line is that you have to build up your economy. And we're not doing, we're still playing the 70s game of blocking. We can block the WTO because it's not doing what we think it should. We can block climate change because we think that the West is not playing a fairness game. But I think the West has gone beyond wanting to listen to arguments about fairness. That's not what they want to hear. They want to hear how can we get things done. And hence, in all these forums, it's increasingly coalitions of the willing. TPP is a coalition of the willing. The transatlantic partnership will be a coalition of the willing. So then you are now getting marginalized. You're being left out of these coalitions. Now, you have to decide, are you okay with that or are you not okay with that? China used the negotiations to enter the WTO 15 years ago to fundamentally reform itself. And now when it looks at TPP, China's got all kinds of immediate worries to sort out about what's happening to them and not sort of blow up. But till this thing happened, they were only focusing on how do we get ourselves ready so that we can actually say we want to be part of TPP. Whereas the scenario here is defensive. No, we don't want to. This is intrusive. This is going beyond normal trade issues. It's going beyond border issues, as they call it, into environment and labor standards. And these are not part of trade things. And we don't want to talk about all this. So it's a very defensive approach. And my belief is it won't get you anywhere because it's a different world.
But, and it seems to me, and I think you may touch on it, is that as India continues to grow, if it gets to be that third, fourth, fifth largest economy, it will have greater influence in the world and needs to step up in some of these areas and decide what its interests are, rather than kind of tagging on to, yes, we're going to go along with the U.S., or we're going to not go along with the U.S., or whoever it might be, and really establishing here's what's in this country's best interest, which might, roll one way one time and a different direction a different time.
I think we know our interests, but we're falling short on our economic management, and therefore you're losing out. I think the way we run our defense system is hopeless. The import decisions on hardware are consumed by scandal and blacklisting and endless delays. The domestic development and production programs are subject to endless delays, and then probably no product delivery at the end of it in some cases. So either way, everybody, I think, slowly is becoming more and more conscious of the fact that our defense forces are simply in no shape to actually get into a fight, if you have to get into a fight. Because you haven't got a modern rifle, you haven't got night vision fighting capabilities, you don't have an air defense environment, your destroyers and frigates don't have anti-submarine helicopters on them because you haven't ordered the helicopters. You don't have long-range missiles because you're still developing them with Israel. Meaning these are ships that can't fight. Right. They look wonderful, 7,000-ton destroyer on the sea, but the damn thing can't fight.
We'd call it destroyer for peace or something.
Yes. Somebody wisecracked saying it's the most peaceful navy in the world.
Peaceful navy, that's right. Interesting challenges. Well, thank you very much.